Good morning and welcome to the Staffordshire Police Fire and Crime Panel. Today is the Monday the 9th of February 2026 and the meeting will be webcast live and archived for 12 months, so I do welcome anybody that may be listening in, and I hope you find it interesting. I'm Councillor Richard Cox, representing Lichfield District Council, and I'm the chairman of the panel. If I can go straight to the agenda, apologies. May we have apologies?
We've received apologies from Chris Elliott, the co-optee, and Councillor Screen.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Mandy. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations at this time? No, I'm not seeing any indication, but as always, I am going to say, if anything does come to mind, please let us know. Item 3 is questions to the Police Fire Crime Commissioner from members of the public. My understanding, there are no questions. So I shall go then to item 4, which is decisions published by the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner. And my understanding is there are no decisions, so we'll move on to item 5, which is the proposed fire and rescue budget and precept for 2026, which includes the MTFS. Commissioner, would you like to introduce the report? And before I go any further, many happy returns for the birthday at the weekend.
Thank you, Chairman. Morning, panel. No doubt a few of you have noticed I look a little older than I did only a week ago. Chairman, I'm sorry to say I don't think this is going to be any more positive than the conversation we had last week, but there is a slight difference, which principally comes down to the so-called fairer funding formula that government have brought in to attempt to distribute funding more appropriately towards where there is vulnerability. I'm going to ask David, our 151 officer, to take us through the detail momentarily. But in arriving at my proposal today, which is a £5 increase, that's the referendum limit set by government for fire and rescue, I regret to say that's another 5.45% increase, which is over inflation. And as I said before, that is not what I believe is necessary when the shortfall we're trying to fill is due to government reductions in funding. Significant reductions in Staffordshire. Across the next 3 years, it's going to put a pressure on the organisation of £2.1 million. The fairer funding is unfairer funding for Staffordshire. It's predicated on population numbers, which means that cities have done well. Rural areas which are not necessarily growing as rapidly in terms of population, have not done well. The Home Office have acknowledged in discussions with commissioners and others that by basing it on population, they're missing the fundamental about community safety. Fire and rescue is principally about vulnerability. Vulnerability is about people's capacities to get out of their property if there's a risk, a danger, a fire. It's related to old type properties, people with mental health problems, addictions, and actually also ageing population. They've failed to look at the detail and they've gone purely on the numbers. Some places which quite frankly don't need the extra money have got it, and places like ours where vulnerability is very much a concern are being cut. I'm going to be a bit more political than I normally would, because to me this is austerity. But unlike austerity as we saw it after the financial crash back in 2008-9, this is austerity where government is quite happy to say, no, your spending power has increased because we're giving you the right to raise more of the money locally. I don't think that's appropriate. However, my role as Commissioner is to do everything I can to keep the services in such a state that they can keep people safe. So it's with some regret, but not because I know how important it is to the service, that I've gone for the full £5 increase. For Band D property, that means people will be paying about £96 a year, and it's probably the best 96 quid they spend. However, nobody's well off at the minute, and they aren't going to be getting any better off in the near future at this rate. So I put it to the panel because it's essential. I'd like to come back after David's taken us through the detail, Chair, because there are implications for the future here, and they're serious. And I think we need to talk about them. And I want to offer you some reassurance that we've got a head around what the solution will be down the road. Can I call David in, Chair? Is that okay?
Absolutely, David.
So, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Commissioner, and good morning, Chairman. As part of this commentary, there are 4 papers in front of the panel today. So I'm going to focus on the main budget and MTFS report, which is then accompanied by the Treasury Management, the Capital and the Reserve Strategy papers. So just as an introduction, this report advises the panel on the revenue budget for next year 26-7 and the proposed level of council tax for the Staffordshire Commissioner Fire and Rescue Authority, as outlined just by the Commissioner. It also presents to the panel an updated MTFS for the following 4-year period to 2030-31. So just to kick off, the panel will be aware that the government consulted on the Fair Funding Review, which outlined the proposals for the next 3-year settlement period. And that was issued by MHCLG back in the summer. So it ran from, the consultation ran from the 20th of June to the 15th of August. Following that, the actual settlement, the local government finance settlement, was received on the 17th of December and incorporated a 3-year settlement, which was the first time we'd seen a multi-year settlement for almost a decade. So, as Ben's outlined, the Fair Funding Review has refreshed the methodology for distributing a fixed pot of funds between local authorities, which are covered by the local government finance settlement. And that's been done using the relative needs formula. Now, whilst many relative needs formulas have been fully reviewed, the data underpinning the fire and rescue relative needs formula has simply been updated to reflect the latest information that's available. This authority, the Staffordshire Commissioner Fire and Rescue Authority, has been adversely affected by the impact of the settlement, and the panel can see that the reduction of 2.13 million in core funding by 28-29 as set out within paragraph 4 of the main report. And as outlined by the Commissioner, in order to mitigate this shortfall, the government has assumed that the council tax will be increased by the full amount every year for the next 3-year period. It's also important for the panel to note there's a significant variation across the fire and rescue sector following this fair funding settlement, with Staffordshire sitting just above the 5 fire and rescue authorities have actually hit the funding floor. The core spending power for next year, as identified within the report, is 3.69%, is actually 0.8% below the national average for 26-7. Which, when we put that into pounds terms, that's around about £500,000 worth of funding that Staffordshire are below, essentially below the average. As set out within the local government finance policy statement, the business rate system has also been reset from the 1st of April 2026. This is also a core part of the government's fair funding review to ensure that local government funding system is fit for the future. Now, the 1% share of business rates under the revised system that the authority will receive at this time, we've based it upon the actual settlement figure. That's primarily because the NNDR1 forms Some were late but weren't available at the time of writing the report. I can just advise the board, the panel today, that the actual shortfall, there is a shortfall in that figure, but it's only a small shortfall of around about £68,000 based upon the data that we've received at the moment. Now, any adjustment will be done through the business rate reserve during the year. I would also like to remind the panel that this latest settlement follows really a disappointing loss of £1 million worth of grants that were announced for the current financial year 25-6, which was in addition to just short of a £300,000 shortfall in the grant that we received for the national insurance increase. So in order to compensate for the reduction in grant funding, the referendum limit for council tax for fire has remained, as it did last year, at £5, which is equivalent to the 5.45%. The budget for next year, 26-7, assumes a full increase of the £5, which is equivalent to 10 pence per week on a Band D council tax bill, which increases that Band D from £91.77 to £96.77. Now, the Commissioner has, the Commissioner decided that in keeping with the approximation of inflation, the council tax increases for the following 2 years, 27-8 and 28-9, should be held at 2.99%, which is below that £5 referendum limit. And as the Commissioner alluded to, this results in a £2.1 million worth of further transformation work that's going to be required by 2029. Now, should the council tax be increased by the full referendum limit for those following 2 years, that shortfall in funding would reduce to £500,000. Both of those figures are demonstrated and shown within Appendices 8 and 9 and is referenced as well within paragraph 48 of the main report. So significant transformation work has already been undertaken by the Transformation Board within Fire, which has been led by Glyn Lugeney. And of course, this work has been fully supported by the Commissioner's Office and has actually resulted in £2.3 million worth of identified and delivered recurring savings set out within the report in front of you today. The Transformation Board will now move into its next phase during 2026 in order to review the savings requirement as contained within the report today. So when we look at total funding, the authority will receive for 26-7 approximately £2 million worth of more funding than it did within the previous year, as shown within paragraph 25 of the report. Now, this assumes a pay award of 3% across all staff groups for next year. And of that £2 million, £1.3 million is taken up by the pay award assumption alone. Now, this assumption, of course, is a risk. Inflation is running higher than that at the moment, and there is already pressure from the representative bodies, which has already commenced. So I think we just need to note that there is a risk with that pay award assumption as we move into next year. If the panel could also note the budget assumptions that are contained within paragraph 51 of the report, and also note that, you know, in addition to additional pay pressures, there may also be additional pressures from pensions and inflation as we move forward. But it's also worth pointing out, and I always point this out, the Commissioner has no control over nationally agreed pay awards or over employee contribution rates into the pension schemes. This settlement and the budget proposal today also result in the authority needing to access its earmarked future funding reserve during the 3-year period in order to support this challenging financial position that we find ourselves in. The reserve strategy and the MTFS assume the use of £1 million worth of reserves will be utilised during the next 4-year period. And members of the panel can see the impact on reserves within Appendix 2 of the report, and the full detail, of course, is included within the full reserve strategy report. If I just move on to the capital programme, if I may, for a moment. In terms of the capital, the full programme for next year is scheduled within Appendix 9 of the report at £5.3 million, with £4.1 million for 26-7, and then £5.4 million for 27-28. The prudential indicators are included within the capital strategy, and the panel should note that funding for capital spending is resulting in a growing capital financing requirement. Whilst the authority has continued to reduce debt and borrowing over the last few years, investment in buildings, operational equipment, of course vehicles and ICT remains an absolute necessity. And of course we receive, or the authority receives, no funding from government, and all investment has to be funded from borrowing or the use of reserves. The capital financing requirement is therefore set to increase into the medium term. So, Chairman, just to close really what I would like to say. Firstly, I am pleased, although it is a challenging position we find ourselves in, I am pleased to present a balanced budget for 26/7 as set out within the reports for the panel's consideration today. However, when taking into account the reduction in fair funding, the impact of the proposed 3% pay award, general inflation pressures, and our comparatively lower core spending power position relative to other authorities, the proposed £5 increase in council tax results in, pretty much at best, a standstill position for this authority. Significant financial challenges also remain now into the medium term. I would therefore ask the panel to note the recommendations contained within the main report, items A to L. And of course members will wish to note that the budget proposals today include a total revenue budget proposal of 57.348 million, alongside the proposed increase in Bandy council tax of 5.45%, equivalent to £5 per year or 10 pence per week, increasing the Bandy to £96.77, which of course is within the referendum limit. So, Chairman, I'm happy to take questions, but I would also like the panel to note the statement I have made with regarding the robustness of the budget and the adequacy of reserves, as required under Section 25 of the Local Government Act, which is referenced within paragraphs 59 and 60 of the main report. So that concludes my notes for today. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, David. I appreciate that. Commissioner, do you want to come back in before we open questions?
Yes, please, Chairman, and thank you to David for taking us through the detail there. Chairman, as David said, we've made the usual very prudent assumptions. I like them to be more likely than unlikely. So that 3% pay, in previous years we've been forecasting pay, I think, a little less enthusiastically than other places. I don't see any point in understating the risk. But if we continue to have overinflation pay increases agreed nationally without any productivity improvement tied into those negotiations, we're in some trouble. That £2.1 million shortfall is based on council tax at inflation for the next 2 years. Now, David and I and the fire chief have had some conversations. It's a very unusual position for a department to elect to set a council tax limit for 3 years. I think they've attempted to do that to offer some reassurance, because fire and rescue services were quite literally on the table after this announcement some months ago. However, I've not put the £5 in the budget in advance, because that's not appropriate. Actually, I don't believe I can. I'm not sure it's even legal. I must consult residents every year about council tax, and I will do that, and I will continue to listen to what they're telling us before factoring that in. But the situation is this: if we have increased costs to make £2.1 million, then we have to look at where service can be reduced. I did require the organisation, and they were ready to do so, to conduct a really, really thorough piece of work around their service delivery. So we have, as any prudent authority would have, things we can reach for if we need to, in an emergency situation. That would amount to in our case here in Staffordshire, thank goodness, not the big cuts or station closures that are being talked about and delivered in other places. But it would possibly mean losing a couple of on-call stations and almost certainly entering into conversations about some shift patterns for our whole-time fire service. Those are not options to be taken lightly. So I will give full consideration to the potential to use £5 again in the future 2 years, and I'll start having a conversation with the public about that right now. My worry is, if pay increases, if inflation increases, I don't know, pensions increase, if the emergency services network costs more than we're all anticipating, and I've talked to you before at panel that this is a £100 billion project that could very easily go wrong in the next few years. If those things get away from us, there is nowhere else to go. There is nowhere else to go. So this is a really tight situation for us here in Staffordshire, despite the efforts of David and the leadership team and everybody who goes out responding to 999 calls and involved in prevention and protection work. It really couldn't be more serious. Remarkably, I've had a number of conversations, not just about the fire budget, but the police budget, with MPs. Labour MPs in Staffordshire wrote to me recently saying, but Ben, you've got this increased spending power. And I'm thinking, are we being gaslit? Or do they really think this is increased spending power? You've only got to look at the numbers to see the impact of reduced central government funding, and building into the spending power, you set these over inflation council tax increases. This is a move from national funding to local funding, at the same time introducing reforms which means local people have got less influence on their services. I mentioned to you last week about the police reform white paper and the move to more centralisation that's inherent in that. There are implications for fire. This is another variable in the next 2 years I've really got to keep my eyes on. Fire and rescue and police, as you know, in Staffordshire, they not only share buildings, but they share HR, they share communications, they share very, very effectively, by the way they procure vehicles and maintain vehicles up at Jets in Stoke-on-Trent. So they both benefit from shared services. If we move to a new police service, which is on a regional basis, I think the potential for the client relationship between police and fire is compromised. Now that might mean, it will mean, more costs for both services as they reskill and take these things on themselves. So one of the things I'm going to be in really non-stop conversation with the new Chief Fire Officer about is how can we further reduce, further make more efficient the cost of those back office services. Can we even afford all our premises? Can we afford to do training just in Staffordshire, or do we do that in partnership with neighbouring fire and rescue services? Now all of those things might be the right thing to do, but doing them under pressure is different from doing them because they're the right thing to do and you've got the time and plan opportunity to plan it properly. So it's going to be a busy 2 years, and I'm abolished. My team's gone in two years' time. Hopefully a number of them will still be around to direct and influence and help the councils and others take this forward. But that's going to be a busy 2 years for me. I've got 2 more council taxes to set, and I intend to keep people as safe as I possibly can. But I can't underestimate, this is getting difficult. Very, very happy to take some questions, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for your candid opening and responses there. So I'm going to offer open to the panel. Councillor Atkins.
Well, first I want to thank David for taking us through the fair funding review, because that was going to be my first question around why Staffordshire is so low on the funding league table. But maybe you could clarify What are the characteristics of Staffordshire which puts us so low on the funding league table? Because obviously there were plenty of other rural counties, but why are we the lowest of the rural counties within the funding review?
Councillor Atkins, I think we'd love to know. I think we'd love to know why Staffordshire has, for decades, been one of the poorest supported in terms of education per head. Why it's one of the poorest in terms of police funding per head of population. We know the county's growing. We're seeing all the new houses, and there's an advantage in that, of course, in the increased council tax take. I think there's some ideological stuff behind it, quite frankly. I think the votes are in the cities. I know that the councils haven't done particularly better as a result of fairer funding in Staffordshire either, and other places have done exceptionally well. I just don't get it. What it certainly isn't is an assessment based on risk and vulnerability, and the Fire and Rescue Service get up every morning considering risk and vulnerability. That's their core job. We've done everything we can to make provision nationally as well as locally. And in fact, nationally, the fire chiefs have been really quite forthright in saying this needs to be revisited. We've got a commitment off MHCLG that they're going to review the fairer funding as far as it affects fire and rescue to take better account of vulnerability. But that's great, you know, that's 3 years down the line. It's not going to happen and resolve the problem today. And as David said, we lost £1 million worth of additional grant funding, which was in place for some years to reflect the shortfall in some authorities anyway. It's just the nature of where we are, unfortunately. It's perhaps a question for your colleagues in Parliament, the explanation behind it, rather than us. We're demonstrating where it leaves us.
Well, I mean, given that you're talking to MPs, I'm surprised you haven't suggested that one of them put down a written question to ask about the detail. I mean, as opposed to an oral question at PMQs or whatever, but a written question which would then outline the issue. Now, obviously, we've had the whole issue of the F24 in education going back, decades about the underfunding of the education sector. But this is obviously significantly different in the sense that we are bottom of the rural counties. So, irrespective of your comment, or your political comment, which I'll pass over, about whether it's ideological or not, there were plenty of other rural counties that, for whatever reason, are above us in the funding league. So it's really about, I'm surprised there haven't been discussions at civil servant level to identify what the factors are. And I'm shocked, actually, that you haven't got that sort of detail at your fingertips.
Chairman, just to offer Councillor Atkins some reassurance, and I believe she supported, when I was education lead for the County Council, I believe you supported, and I was grateful for the all-party support for the challenge back to government about education funding. I mean, that was a rolling conversation. Didn't get us anywhere then with that government either, quite frankly. We have been in conversation with department leads. I've actually had personal conversations representing the fire commissioners with the new Minister for Fire, who I really think is a really excellent minister. Fire and Rescue has been brought up in my conversations with the Staffordshire MPs, and I'll share a letter with you when I've wrapped it up around the funding around policing. I would acknowledge the support of all Staffordshire MPs actually around flexibility on policing numbers. It doesn't go far enough because it still doesn't stop the Home Secretary telling a Chief Constable how to deploy their resources and the nature of the resources. But I appreciate the support there. It just hasn't got us where we need to be. And I think this conversation is being played out. It's not just about rural counties. If you go to the northeast, the most affected councils and fire and rescue services are in the northeast, often in old urban environments which have really been short of investment. There's some really high risk there, and they've been absolutely kicked in the teeth by this fairer funding formula.
I think, as the Commissioner says, it's been very difficult in order to fully understand the transparency around the review and the way the formulas have been worked. And if I can just I'm just looking at the consultation response that the NFCC sent back, and I think they've pointed out there that one of the biggest issues is that a lot of the formula that's been reviewed has been based upon population. So, you know, where population increases have had a higher impact upon the relative needs formula and the way it's been recalculated. And that really, what happens then when you look at the results of that, some of the worst affected FRAs are those with the highest levels of deprivation. So because of the way the formula's been done for fire, it's not necessarily resulted in the outcomes that we would have expected. So there is still quite a lot of issues around that formula, and I know the NFCC through their work are looking at, and I know that MHCLG will be looking at the relative needs formula again as we move forward. So there are issues that have been highlighted following the consultation.
Can I move on to pay? You've rightly identified that it's a big risk to assume that the pay award will be 3%. But not only that, in future years, you've got a pay award of 2% as an expectation, which I think is going to be relatively low unless inflation does meet the government target of 2%. So given that the award is likely to be above 3%, obviously that's important if you're going to recruit firefighters. The pay does have to keep in tune with people's expectations, otherwise you're going to find problems recruiting. If it does go above 3%, presumably you'll be hitting the reserves again. You're already hitting the reserves quite significantly over the period of the medium-term financial strategy. So would that be your fallback position going into reserves?
Chair, Councillor Atkins is absolutely correct. It's a big risk. And I'm very keen, as I said, these assumptions, that's item 51, by the way, for colleagues on the panel, page 20 at the top there. So 3% this coming year, which I think's reasonable, but probably going to be above inflation. 2% going forward is where the inflation is forecast to be. Other places consistently under forecast. We've not done that. We've stayed at inflation for pay. There's only a little bit of room in reserves, I'm afraid, Councillor. That comes back to my point earlier. There are so many likely pressures that we're as near to service reductions as we could be. And my capacity, even with that extra flexibility on the council tax, is really, really limited. If we have another giveaway on national pay settlements, we're in trouble. The only people paying for these pay settlements is the local householder. There isn't enough in reserves to cover it.
Just come back quickly. Of course, the role of the fire service has changed over the years, much more of a prevention of fire, of fires rather than necessarily fighting fires. How is the workforce being adapted to that new role? Is it reducing in numbers? Are you allocating people to different roles? How is that impacting on the way that you're looking at the future of the service?
Councillor, you're quite right, and as David outlined, we've made £2.3 million of savings in the last 4 years. When I arrived nearly 5 years ago now, the one criticism in the His Majesty's Inspector's report was around the service really getting stuck into its productivity challenges. That's That's not the case now in terms of right sizing those protection and prevention teams. £2.3 million on a budget of 50 odd is quite a big challenge. We haven't reduced frontline teams. As you know, actually, we've spent more on frontline, particularly in on-call, having introduced the riding in threes, because it means there's more of them out there going to more incidents more of the time, and that's increased the pay budget. But it's getting to the point now, and this is why I was keen to emphasise earlier, my real focus on the next step is to look for opportunities to share costs with neighbours. Fire reform, regrettably, didn't make the progress it should have made under the Conservative government before. We all agreed it was the right thing to do, operational independence for fire, more commissioners, quite frankly, so they could make quicker decisions, more effective decisions than the old fire authority model. And there was some progress being made, particularly in Staffordshire, working with the NHS, as you know, and sharing services with police. I'm afraid the decisions recently make some of that investment tricky to hold on to, and probably there'll be a cost in working back from some of it, which is really disappointing. I know with the Minister's keen to continue the reform on fire, particularly for a college, get some standards and consistency in place. I would, right now, I'd be a little bit braver as government and say, let's take the same sort of approach as we're likely to do with policing. And how many fire and rescue services do we need? How many chiefs, how many senior leadership teams do we need? Certainly, how many back office services do we need? And my real nervousness, and I mentioned this last week as well, if we're going to partner up with people, start sharing costs, sharing offices, we need to know who we're partnered with. So I'm a little nervous. Do we reach out to Shropshire, Derbyshire, Warwickshire, wherever, to look to share costs in the next couple of years and avoid these service costs? Only to be told, actually, they're not your preferred partner 3 or 4 years down the line. It's a tricky moment. But that will be my first resort. My last resort is cutting the teams that respond to emergencies. And I don't really feel, not in the age of Grenfell, that it is right to go further into the protection and prevention teams either. Whether we can share them, make them a little more effective across borders, I think that's what we'll be looking at. But there's no fat in this organisation to cut that doesn't mean risk for residents and businesses.
Thank you. Councillor Walker, City of Stoke-on-Trent.
Thank you, Chair. Just ask the Commissioner if I could, regarding the settlement. Has the final figure been confirmed as yet? Because I understood there was an announcement due today on the final figure. Has that come through, or are you aware? On the other points, I agree regarding you mentioned the fairer funding formula. It's not ideal. It's based on, from my understanding, data from 2019, which is then pre-dedicated on data from actually a census in 2011. So it could be improved on. Most certainly, I'll say that myself. We were promised fairer funding formulas for many years during the Conservative years, which never happened. The Commissioner mentions austerity. You know, I'd agree with him on that. I mean, communities have suffered terribly through austerity over the years. Mentions the North East. I mean, I regularly visit the North East. I'll be there again Wednesday, and I totally agree. Some areas there have real serious social deprivation. So I'd just ask the question on the confirmation of the funding settlement, if that's actually been rubber stamped as yet. Because that could help us with this decision today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walker, and nice to see you. Welcome to the panel. I appreciate your candid comments about the funding formula not not being ideal. And yeah, you're right. It really is difficult for authorities like yours and like those in the North East who are suffering as a result. Last week there was just a momentary pause because the settlement for police had not been fully established until almost the day before the police budget was to be set in this room. I don't believe we were waiting for anything else from Fire and Rescue, but perhaps David could just confirm.
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. No, we've not received the final settlement at the moment. I know the National Fire Chiefs Council were continuing to lobby government, but I'm not aware. And we don't normally see any changes from the provisional to the final settlement, but we'll wait and see. But in answer to your question, we've not received the final settlement at this time.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Councillor Krupski.
Thank you. My question really is regarding delivery of the £2.1 million worth of saving target as per the transformation programme. We seem to have very limited information in that area as to what the savings are, their value, and the timescales that they will materialise. I wonder whether you'd like to comment.
We're pretty comfortable with £500,000 of that. That's what we've been working towards for the last couple of years. As I've said, we've then got a series of options which are essentially based around service review. I'll be completely open and frank with you. It would mean consideration of 24-hour shifts in one or two areas, and it would or alternatively those on-call stations which are called upon or available actually to the lowest degree might have to close. That is absolutely my last resort. They are worked up, but they are not something I'm looking to reach for in the next 2 years. The nature of this funding formula change is we really only understood the detail of this just before Christmas. And then there's been extensive lobbying to try and say, hold on, do you realise what you're doing? So I think it's fair challenge that this isn't a plan to make the savings in those ways. It is it's a window we've got to fill. And as I've said to you, I'm going to have a conversation with the public about how we can limit that by using the full £5 flexibility. But I'm not making a firm decision on that. We do need to consider those savings. More importantly, if pay increases, there are costs associated with police reform. If other factors come into play, then they're over and above the 2.1 million. So some of the areas in which we might find further savings will be quickly exhausted with what might come in the next few months. I'm sorry, Councillor, it's a toughie this is in terms of setting out the detail. The only assurance I hope you take is that you know in the past the team at Fire and Rescue, the team at Staffordshire Police and myself, when we've said we're going to make savings, we've made them. And in a way that hasn't compromised on the service that people are receiving. That's what I'd like to achieve in the next 2 years as well.
Councillor Dane, Tamworth.
Thank you. It follows on a little from the last question with regards to our reserves and balances and the fact that they're going down year by year. The scenarios that you're talking about with maybe higher pay awards, some emergency crisis, you know, when we spoke earlier, the panel are quite worried about how quickly those reserves could be eaten up, and do we have any contingency plans to ensure that we keep them? And what, I should know this, but what is the level that we have to keep them at to keep ourselves safe?
Perhaps I could ask David just where we are on the reserves. We've got a mixture. Earmarked reserves are for particular projects. There was some reference, unfortunately, Chair, in the comments of the panel member that didn't endorse my recommendation last week about use of reserves. I did wonder whether he'd fully appreciated earmarked reserves aren't a choice. They're actually money put aside to deliver certain projects. In some cases, to deliver a project that might lead to ongoing savings or essential investment. The general reserve is typically kept at appropriate standards, as you'd well know, with the Borough Council. And we heard from the Police 151 then that 2 or 3 emergencies could quickly gobble those up. It would not be prudent to use reserves to the degree that you have to make an emergency cut in something further down the line. But David, perhaps you could just reassure us that we're not sitting on reserves. I don't know too much about fire and rescue services elsewhere in terms of their reserves, but we haven't got a stash hidden away in the cupboard, have we?
Thank you, Commissioner. Absolutely no, we haven't got a stash, a big stash in the cupboard. But what we have got is in line with the requirement. We've got 2 sort of reserves. We've got a general reserve, which is based upon an assessment of high and medium risk. So this is the eventuality of something really serious happened within Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent, that we'd be able to deal with a big major incident, for example. The general reserve's been held at just over £1.9 million now for the last 20 years. It's not really changed, other than the fact that as the budget's grown, the percentage is now lower. It's below 4% of our total revenue budget. Now, the sort of the benchmark is the general reserve shouldn't be any more than 4% really, or there needs to be a good reason for it to be at a higher level. But the earmark reserves are reserves that, you know, we're not allowed to keep reserves unless there's a reason for keeping them, and we've hopefully put forward within the reserve strategy the reasons why we have got some reserves and balances as we move forward. And for example, one of the risks is around the pension reserve. So the pension reserve is held because at the moment we receive £1.2 million worth of pension grant to support the increase in contributions into the firefighter pension scheme. As soon as that grant is baselined into our funding, then we won't necessarily need to keep the reserve, but that reserve covers us for 1 year should that grant be removed suddenly by the government. In terms of the important reserve around our future funding, that reduces over a period of time, so we pretty much exhaust that reserve by 29-30 based upon the strategy that's in front of us today. But there is a little bit left as we move towards the end. So in total, our earmarked reserves, so our usable reserves, if you like, reduced from 6.8 million, which was what they were at March 25, and then they're forecast to go down to 3.4 million by 29-30. So there's still some cushion there should the pay award, for example, come in higher. But I think what we would have to do is, following on the question from Councillor Atkins, if the pay award came in at 5% and we had a big pressure, then we would need to reassess our savings profile into the medium term and actually readjust what we need to do. So, because we always need to make sure that we are maintaining and holding some reserve, so that we've got a little bit of flexibility. Otherwise, when the external auditors start looking at our going concern, which they do every year, they always look at our cash flow and our going concern position. If we start to deplete the reserves where there's very little left, then that starts to raise questions about our financial viability as we move forward.
I just come back on that. I suppose the question then actually is to you, David, as the 151 officer. Are you comfortable with those figures and that we're covered?
I think, based upon the challenges that we faced, based upon years of cuts and austerity, I'm comfortable that the reserves, as we see them today, as we move forward, are reasonable and will allow some flexibility as we move forward. They're not great, they're not massive, but but there is a little bit of wriggle room. So yeah, so I am comfortable with the position that's presented to the panel today.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from members? I think this is not an easy one for sure, absolutely, and I think we've had some candid responses to where we're at and how we're going to set things. So, if I may, I'm going to recess the meeting now for us to decide on our options on to accept or otherwise. So I'll close the meeting and we'll reassemble as soon as we've completed our deliberations. Thank you very much. Welcome back. I open the meeting, and we've obviously had a good, robust discussion. I think, if I may ask, we've got recommendations before us. Do I have a proposer? Councillor
To
Dean.
propose, Chair.
Councillor Atkins. So that is to accept the report in full. And those members, are you in agreement? So that is unanimous, those that are present, so thank you. So, Commissioner, we do accept the report. I think there is a caveat to it that obviously we recognise that if we were to ask for something else that might be detrimental in terms of zeal and a nil increase or whatever, that is not going forward and that isn't going to help. So we have to accept where we are. But I think we are probably, as time goes by, we are wanting to see what the outcomes of where we are, because I used the word in a sense that I think our public do wish to obviously have a service that is fit for purpose and ensuring that safety. And we recognise that obviously with the forces, fire and rescue is the prevention more so than it was on the fire fighting. But nevertheless, that the public will want to be assured that they are getting their value of their 10 pence to the in the D band of our council tax. So I think it is important that it's acknowledged that we will need to be really going forward, know what is happening. I think we also do know how difficult it's going to be with the re-government organisation and possible with the police amalgamation of how that sets going forward. I think there's a clear concern in terms within Staffordshire, because we do have those shared premises, and it's something that obviously that is to be thought of. But those are the things that we've got to be forward thinking, how we're going to address those issues if there is a police amalgamation and county-wise stays as it is with its fire and rescue. So I think those are clear messages from us. But thank you, Commissioner, for the presentations, and may I thank David Greensmith, thank you, and on the occasion of being your last budget precept, because I hear retirement is pending, may I thank you on behalf of the panel for the excellent way that you have contributed and presented these reports to us and giving us clear understanding and everything that goes with it. So it is to wish you well in your future, and a thank you.
Many thanks, Chair, and thank you to everybody. Appreciate it.
Commissioner?
Chair, thank you. I think as you've seen today, David's peaked. He's going out at the top. I couldn't have had better advice, more courteously and given over the last few years. I've been extremely lucky. And Chairman, if I may, you recall, Sarah at the back of the room here, Sarah was given your approval to be the 151 officer for my office recently. I'm pleased to say she's going to continue to assist us in that role, but Sarah's been successful in being appointed as the next 151 officer for fire and rescue. And I think if she takes the job on with such passion and enthusiasm as David has, we're going to be in very, very strong hands So thank you to both of them. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I think that's welcome, Sarah. And I think it's encouraging to hear because it's the one thing we all want in very many cases is stability in that continuation of what we do. So thank you for that. So again, Commissioner, thank you. Commissioner.
I mean, just one brief note, and I thank you, and I really note your recommendations there. It sounds like the whole panel's in the same place as I am, really. This isn't as certain a period as going forward as I would like, but don't worry, we'll sort it, we'll get through it. What I would just like to say, I've neglected to mention, ourselves and Northamptonshire are the only two fire commission areas which are not already in a mayoralty. So there is also another uncertainty around, well, what does that mean as we move to the new panels? You as a panel, of course, will be replaced at the end of 2028 with a police and crime panel made up of council leaders, most likely here. What we're uncertain about, is that going to be a police, fire and crime panel, or will there be a reversion to the fire authorities that are in place elsewhere? So more uncertainty, just to keep us all entertained.
Okay, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of agenda item number 5. So if I can go to number 6, which is questions to the Police, Fire, Crime Commissioner by panel members. Do I have any questions from members on this occasion? I know we did it last week, so I think we'll move on that front to item 7. Dates for future meetings and work programme. Are there any items on the work programme? What I will say is that we have the date of next Monday on the 16th of February reserved in our diaries. I'm delighted to give you the morning off because we have agreed business. So we won't be meeting next Monday. And our next one will be then April.
13th of April.
13th of April. And items on the work programme we discussed last week. So are there any additions to that? No? So moving on then. That concludes the meeting. There is no in private, so we formally close this meeting. And can I ask members to be reassemble for an 11:30 start for the confirmation of the fire chief of the brigade. So formally close the meeting at, we'll say, at 11:15, and if members could be back for an 11:30 start. Thank you.